Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The mountains of western Japan stood sentinel over a landscape of quiet beauty, where the prefectures of Shermaine and Hiroshima met in a tapestry of forested peaks and rural communities. In the autumn of 2009, these ancient hills bore witness to a darkness that would haunt the region for 7 long years, a mystery so disturbing that even its eventual solution would provide more horror than comfort. Miyako Hiroka was 19 years old, a bright spark of optimism in a world that stretched before her with infinite possibility. Born and raised in Sakade City in Kagawa Prefecture, she had grown up with dreams that reached beyond the familiar horizons of her hometown. She harbored ambitions of studying abroad, of experiencing cultures beyond Japan's shores, of becoming someone who could make a difference in the world. In April 2009, she took her first significant step toward that future by enrolling at Shermaine Prefectural University in the coastal city of Hamada. Moving away from home represented both freedom and responsibility for Miyako. She settled into a university dormitory, sharing her living space with roommates who would come to know her as dedicated, conscientious, and kind. Miyako threw herself into campus life with characteristic enthusiasm, joining a social service club devoted to helping those in need. Her volunteer work reflected a deep compassion for others, a desire to contribute positively to her community, even as she pursued her education. But university tuition and living expenses required financial support, so Miyako sought part-time employment to supplement her studies. She found work at an ice cream shop located in a shopping center in Minatomaki, a district of Hamada. The job seemed innocuous enough, serving customers sweet treats and earning the money she needed to sustain her independent life. Yet there was one aspect of the position that troubled her: the late-night shifts that required her to walk home alone through quiet, isolated areas after the shopping center closed. Miyako confided her concerns to her parents during phone conversations, mentioning that she felt uncomfortable traversing the secluded route between the shopping center and her dormitory in the darkness. She had begun looking for alternative employment, something safer, something closer to campus that would not require her to walk alone at night. She planned to quit the ice cream shop soon, to find work that would allow her to maintain her independence without the nagging anxiety that accompanied those solitary late-night journeys. But timing, as it so often does, betrayed her. October 26, 2009, began as an ordinary Monday. Miyako attended her classes at Shermaine Prefectural University, taking notes and participating in discussions as she always did. At 4:30 in the afternoon, she left campus and made her way to the shopping center where she was scheduled to work the evening shift at the ice cream shop. She arrived on time, donned her uniform, and began serving customers with the same cheerful professionalism she brought to every shift. The hours passed in the familiar rhythm of retail work, scooping ice cream, operating the register, wiping down counters, engaging in brief conversations with customers. As the evening deepened and the shopping center's foot traffic thinned, Miyako prepared to close the shop for the night. At approximately 9:15 in the evening, security cameras captured her leaving the ice cream parlor, her shift complete. The footage showed a young woman finishing another workday, her mind perhaps already turning toward the walk ahead or the studies that awaited her back at the dormitory. But Miyako never arrived home. Her roommates noticed her absence, but initially assumed she had encountered some unplanned circumstance, perhaps spending the night with a friend or dealing with an unexpected situation. It was not until the following day, October 27th, when Miyako failed to appear for classes and her supervisor at the ice cream shop could not reach her by phone, that genuine concern began to crystallize. The shop owner attempted multiple times to contact Miyako, each unanswered call deepening the sense that something was wrong. Finally, unable to reach her directly, the owner contacted Miyako's parents in Kagawa Prefecture. The news struck them with immediate alarm. Their daughter, their conscientious, responsible Miyako, had vanished without explanation or contact. On November 2, 2009, the Shermaine Prefectural Police made the case public, issuing appeals for information about Miyako's whereabouts. Her photograph appeared on news broadcasts and in newspapers across the region. Investigators canvassed the area between the shopping center and the university dormitory, searching for witnesses who might have seen the young woman on the night of October 26th. They reviewed security camera footage from various locations along her presumed route home, hoping to trace her movements after she left work. The footage revealed a troubling gap. While cameras at the shopping center clearly showed Miyako departing at 9:15 in the evening, she did not appear on any of the roadside security cameras positioned along the route to her dormitory. It was as if she had simply vanished between the shopping center and her residence, swallowed by the autumn darkness. 4 days later, on November 6, 2009, the mystery took a horrific turn. A man foraging for mushrooms in the mountains near the summit of Mount Garyu, Hiroshima Prefecture, stumbled upon something that would transform his innocent autumn outing into a nightmare. Partially hidden among the undergrowth, he discovered a human head, severed from its body and abandoned in the forest approximately 25 kilometers from the shopping center where Miyako had last been seen. The discovery sent shockwaves through both Hiroshima and Shermaine prefectures. Police immediately cordoned off the area and initiated a comprehensive search of the surrounding mountains. The head was transported to forensic specialists who conducted DNA analysis to determine the victim's identity. The results confirmed what investigators had begun to fear. The remains belonged to Miyako Hiroka, the missing university student whose disappearance had been publicized just days earlier. The confirmation transformed a missing person investigation into a homicide case of staggering brutality. A joint task force combining officers from both the Hiroshima and Shermaine prefectural police forces was immediately assembled, recognizing that the disposal of remains across prefecture boundaries suggested careful planning and mobility on the part of the perpetrator. As the search of the mountainous area intensified, investigators made additional gruesome discoveries. Miyako's dismembered torso was found. The condition of the remains revealed a level of violence that shocked even experienced homicide detectives. Miyako had been severely beaten about the head before her death. Her body bore evidence of burns, leading to speculation in the Japanese press that the perpetrator may have engaged in acts too disturbing to fully contemplate. Forensic pathologists determined that Miyako had been strangled to death, with ligature marks visible on her neck consistent with a cord or rope. The bruising on her face indicated she had been badly beaten during her final moments. But the violence had not ended with her death. The killer had then methodically dismembered her body and inflicting mutilations that suggested either extreme rage or a calculated desire to prevent identification. Among the physical evidence recovered at the scene, investigators found items that would prove crucial to the investigation. Shoes that appeared to belong to Miyako were discovered near the dump site. More significantly, plastic bags believed to have been used to transport portions of her body were found in the vicinity. One piece of plastic stuck to her bloodstained remains caught the attention of investigators. It was identified as part of a bag used by NTT, a major telecommunications company, specifically the type used to deliver telephone directories. Detectives traced the design and distribution of this particular plastic bag, discovering it came from a delivery batch distributed in 1995 to 5 specific cities in Hiroshima Prefecture. This detail, seemingly minor, suggested the killer had connections to Hiroshima, that he had preserved this plastic for over a decade, and that he was likely familiar with the mountainous terrain where Miyako's remains had been scattered. Despite the scale of the investigation and the allocation of significant resources, leads proved frustratingly scarce. The police received approximately 30 tips from the public in the immediate aftermath of the discovery, but most led nowhere. One taxi driver reported seeing a woman matching Miyako's description following two men near JR Hamada Station around 9:30 in the evening on October 29th, but the timing did not align with the known facts of her disappearance, and the lead could not be substantiated. Investigators pursued every avenue. They reviewed Miyako's personal life, searching for romantic connections, conflicts, or enemies who might have wished her harm. They found none. By all accounts, Miyako was a dedicated student with no known adversaries, no troubled relationships, no suspicious associations. Her life had been remarkably ordinary, marked by hard work, volunteer service, and plans for a bright future. The case became one of the most intensive investigations the region had ever witnessed. The National Police Agency's Scientific Research Institute was brought in to assist with criminal profiling. Based on the evidence and the nature of the crime, profilers concluded the perpetrator was likely a male between his late 20s and early 40s, someone with knowledge of the local geography, access to transportation, and the physical strength to overpower and transport a victim. In early 2010, the case was formally classified as a special investigation, and authorities announced a reward of up to 3 million yen for information leading to an arrest. Such bounties were typically reserved for cases that had gone cold for at least 6 months, but the severity and brutality of Miyako's murder warranted immediate action. Yet despite the rewards, the profiling, the hundreds of hours of police work, and the public appeals, the case remained unsolved. Years passed with no arrests, no suspects, no justice for Miyako or her grieving family. On October 26, 2012, exactly 3 years after Miyako's disappearance, the statute of limitations for certain aspects of the case technically expired under Japanese law as it existed at that time. But both the Shermaine and Hiroshima prefectural police refused to abandon the investigation. They continued distributing flyers on the anniversary of Miyako's disappearance, maintaining a visible presence at JR Hamada Station and the shopping center where she had worked, hoping that someone somewhere might come forward with the crucial piece of information that would break the case open. The years stretched into a painful limbo for Miyako's family. Her parents, who had encouraged her dreams of studying abroad and supported her move to Shermaine University, were left with only grief and unanswered questions. The promising young woman who had joined a social service club and worked part-time to support her education would never achieve her ambitions, never travel the world, never fulfill the potential that had burned so brightly within her. What investigators did not know, what they could not have known during those long years of fruitless searching, was that the person responsible for Miyako's death had himself died just days after her body was discovered in the mountains of Hiroshima Prefecture. Yasuharu Yano was 33 years old in October 2009. A native of the region, he had experienced his share of legal troubles in earlier years, serving time for previous offenses before apparently turning his life around. He found employment in sales and demonstrated sufficient aptitude to earn a promotion to branch manager at his company in Shermaine Prefecture. By outward appearances, Yano was a success story, a man who had overcome his past and built a legitimate, productive life. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, something dark festered in Yano's psyche. His online behavior raised concerns among those who knew him, though the specific nature of these activities would not be fully understood until years later. In the days surrounding Miyako's murder, Yano exhibited behavior that, in retrospect, screamed of guilt and fear. On October 26th, the same day Miyako disappeared, Yano made an unusual request at work. He asked for a temporary transfer, confiding to a co-worker in cryptic terms that he had done something. The statement was vague enough to avoid immediate alarm, but specific enough to lodge in the co-worker's memory. A few days later, on November 6th, the same day Miyako's severed head was discovered in the mountains, Yano requested time off from work, claiming he needed to visit his deceased father's grave. 2 days later, on November 8, 2009, Yasuharu Yano and his mother died in a fiery car crash. The circumstances of the accident raised immediate questions. Had Yano lost control of the vehicle accidentally, or had he deliberately driven to his death, consumed by guilt over what he had done to Miyako? The truth died with him in the flames, but speculation would persist for years about whether the crash represented suicide or tragic coincidence. With no clear suspects and no evidence linking Yano to Miyako's murder at that time, the investigation continued without him. His death went unremarked in the context of the case, just another fatality on Japan's roads, unconnected in the minds of investigators to the horror that had been perpetrated against a 19-year-old university student. The years accumulated. Miyako's case remained open but cold, a file that officers reviewed periodically but could not solve. Then in 2016, 7 years after the murder, a breakthrough emerged from an unexpected source. Investigators had never completely abandoned Yano as a potential person of interest, though without evidence, they had been unable to make any connection. In the summer of 2016, police decided to take another look at Yano's background and associations. They visited his former employer and conducted interviews with his family members. On October 28, 2016, they executed a search of the house where Yano had lived in Hamada City before his death. Although Yano had been dead for 7 years, investigators hoped that something might have been preserved, some evidence that family members had unknowingly retained. Their perseverance was rewarded when they obtained a USB flash drive from someone close to Yano. The drive appeared to have been wiped clean, its files deleted in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. But digital forensics experts understand a fundamental truth about computer storage. Deleting files does not truly erase them. The deletion process merely removes the pathway that allows normal computers to access the data, but the information itself remains buried deep in the memory until it is overwritten by new data. The forensic team set to work recovering what Yano had tried to hide. What they uncovered was nothing short of horrifying. 57 photograph files were recovered from the USB drive. Approximately 40 of these images contained critical evidence related to Miyako's murder. The photographs depicted her dismembered body in graphic detail, documenting the atrocities committed against her with such disturbing clarity that police have never released them to the public. Among the images was a photograph of a kitchen knife, its blade stained with what appeared to be blood, likely the weapon used to mutilate Miyako's body. The discovery was conclusive. Yasuharu Yano had murdered Miyako Hiroka, photographed the evidence of his crime, and stored those images on a digital device. When he realized the investigation was intensifying, or perhaps when guilt overwhelmed him, he had attempted to delete the files. But technology preserved what conscience could not erase. Police also reviewed electronic toll collection system records from the period of Miyako's disappearance. Vehicles matching Yano's were recorded moving through key intersections during the time frame when Miyako vanished and when her body was disposed of in the mountains. The circumstantial and digital evidence combined to create an incontrovertible case. On December 20th, 2016, 7 years after Miyako's murder, police held a press conference announcing that the case had been officially solved. Yasuharu Yano was identified as the perpetrator and was posthumously indicted on charges of murder, corpse mutilation, and abandonment of a body. The Joint Task Force of Hiroshima and Shermaine Prefectural Police presented their findings to prosecutors, documenting in meticulous detail the evidence that confirmed Yano's guilt. In January 2017, the local prosecutor formally announced that while Yano would have faced charges for his crimes, the case would be dismissed without prosecution due to his death. The legal system could not punish a dead man, but at least the truth had finally emerged. Miyako's family, after 7 agonizing years of uncertainty, received confirmation of what had happened to their beloved daughter. Yet questions lingered. Police were never able to establish a clear motive for why Yano had targeted Miyako. There was no evidence of any personal connection between them, no known trigger that might explain such extreme violence. The randomness of it, the senselessness, made the crime all the more disturbing. Some skeptics even suggested conspiracy theories, claiming Yano might have been a scapegoat and that evidence could have been planted, though no credible evidence ever supported these fringe theories. Others, particularly those steeped in Japanese spiritual traditions, offered a different interpretation. Shinto beliefs, deeply rooted in Japanese culture, hold that spirits of the deceased can influence events in the living world. Some theorized that Miyako's angry spirit had orchestrated Yano's death in the car crash, exacting supernatural vengeance for the atrocities committed against her. Whether one interprets the crash as accident, suicide, or spiritual retribution depends on one's worldview. But the timing, just 2 days after her severed head was discovered, struck many as too significant to be mere coincidence. For Miyako's parents and loved ones, the resolution of the case brought a measure of closure, but could never restore what had been stolen. Miyako had been a young woman of exceptional promise, someone who dreamed of exploring the world and helping others, who volunteered her time in service clubs and worked hard to support her education. She had moved to Hamada with hope and ambition, ready to build a future that would honor her family and fulfill her potential. Instead, she became the victim of a crime so brutal that its details remain partially shielded from public view to this day. The mountains of western Japan, places of natural beauty and ancient reverence, became the final resting place for a 19-year-old girl who had done nothing to deserve such a fate. The case of Miyako Hiroka stands as one of the most haunting unsolved then-solved murders in modern Japanese criminal history. It demonstrates both the persistence of dedicated investigators who refuse to abandon the search for truth, and the chilling reality that sometimes justice comes too late to provide meaningful accountability. Yashaharu Yano escaped earthly punishment for his crimes, dying before he could be brought to trial, leaving behind only digital remnants of his depravity to finally reveal the truth. Miyako's story serves as a somber reminder of vulnerability and the randomness of violence, of how a young woman simply trying to earn money for her education could become the target of incomprehensible cruelty. Her memory endures not in the horror of her death, but in the promise of the life she never got to live, in the dreams that died with her on a dark October night in 2009. Story 2. The sun blazed over Clearwater, Florida on February 3rd, 2008, casting brilliant light across the pristine streets where multi-million-dollar homes stood testament to the success of their residents. It was Super Bowl Sunday, one of those rare occasions when Americans from every corner of the country gathered around televisions to watch the New York Giants face the New England Patriots in a clash that would become legendary. Inside one particular house in this picturesque coastal town, 57-year-old Larry Fenton settled into his favorite chair, anticipating an afternoon of football, pizza, and the simple pleasures of a lazy Sunday. He had worked hard to build his fortune, selling surgical equipment with a combination of business acumen and genuine care for his clients, accumulating wealth that allowed him to retire comfortably and enjoy the fruits of decades of labor. As he switched on the television that afternoon, watching sports while waiting for the big game to begin, he had no reason to suspect that these would be his final hours, that the woman he had married in a whirlwind romance just 3 years earlier would soon be calling emergency services to report his death. Rebecca Ein Fenton seemed, to those who knew her casually, to be living a fairy tale. The attractive blonde had met Larry at a gym where both worked out regularly, and their connection had been immediate and intense. After only 3 months of dating, they became engaged, and within a year they were married, first in a ceremony in Clearwater, and then 4 months later in a second celebration in Laughlin, Nevada, so that Rebecca's friends and family, who had missed the first wedding, could witness their union. Larry was smitten with his new bride, a woman decades his junior who brought energy and vitality into his life. For Rebecca, the marriage represented a dramatic transformation from her previous existence as a nursing assistant who loved travel and adventure to the role of a wealthy man's wife, freed from the necessity of work and surrounded by luxury. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect marriage, Currents of discontent and hidden truths swirled in patterns that would only become visible after tragedy struck. Rebecca had given up her job and her independence to become Larry's full-time companion, and while the material comforts were undeniable, the lifestyle proved isolating in ways she had not anticipated. Larry, who had been social and engaged before the marriage, withdrew from his previous activities and friendships, preferring to keep to himself and his new wife. Rebecca felt bored and constrained, missing the excitement and variety of her former life. She had also concealed aspects of her past from Larry, or at least from the public narrative of their relationship, including a history of working as a high-priced escort before they met, though she would later insist Larry had known about this chapter of her life. On that particular Sunday afternoon, Rebecca went out to their home gym, a separate building on their property where she could exercise in privacy. She spent approximately 2 hours working out, a routine that was not unusual for someone who maintained her physical fitness with dedication. Before heading to the gym, she had checked on Larry, who was comfortably watching television and planning to order pizza later to enjoy during the Super Bowl. Their final exchange, according to Rebecca, consisted of Larry telling her, "I love you," as she left the house. A tender moment frozen in time that painted a picture of a loving couple whose devotion to each other was genuine and mutual. What happened next would become the subject of intense scrutiny, forensic analysis, and courtroom debate. Rebecca's account of events would be examined from every angle, each word dissected for truth or deception, each claimed action tested against the physical evidence that told its own silent story. According to Rebecca, as she was working out in the gym, she heard noises that sounded like sharp bangs, possibly firecrackers or gunshots. She couldn't be certain what they were, and after a moment of listening, she continued her workout. When she finally returned to the main house around 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, she walked into a scene of horror that would be seared into her memory forever. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house appeared to have been ransacked. Cabinet doors hung open, drawers had been pulled out, and belongings were scattered across the floors. But it was the sight in the living room that stopped Rebecca's heart. Larry lay on the floor in a massive pool of blood, his body motionless, his eyes open and staring. Rebecca would later describe going into a haze, a state of shock and disbelief as she tried to process what she was seeing. She knelt down and tried to take Larry's pulse, believing he might still be alive because his eyes were open. Finding the house in disarray, she ran upstairs to see if the intruders were still present, discovering more chaos with items thrown about in the bedrooms. She returned downstairs and checked Larry's pulse again before finally going outside to call for help. At approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Rebecca Fenton dialed 911. The recording of that call would later become a crucial piece of evidence, analyzed not just for the information it contained, but for the language Rebecca used, the tone of her voice, and the priorities she revealed in her moment of crisis. On the call, she was audibly distressed, crying and begging for someone to come help. She told the operator that she had come home from working out in the gym to find her husband lying in blood. Throughout the call, she emphasized repeatedly that she had been in the gym, stating this fact 8 separate times as though establishing the point with absolute clarity. She believed Larry might still be alive and urged the dispatcher to send help immediately. She described him as her life, her everything, the man she loved more than anything. When police and paramedics arrived at the Fenton residence, they entered a scene that presented itself as a home invasion turned deadly. The ransacked appearance of the house, with belongings strewn about and cabinets emptied, suggested burglars had been searching for valuables. Larry's Jeep Cherokee was missing from the driveway, apparently stolen by whoever had invaded the home. But as paramedics examined Larry's body, they confirmed what Rebecca must have already known in her heart. He was dead, killed by 4 gunshot wounds to his neck and back. The blood evidence showed that once he fell, he had never moved again. Life had left him quickly, violently, in his own home on a sunny afternoon when he should have been safe. For the uniformed officers who arrived first, the scene initially appeared straightforward. a tragic but unfortunately common scenario of a burglary that turned fatal when the homeowner was home. But Detective Michael Hasty of the Clearwater Police Department, a seasoned investigator with years of experience reading crime scenes, immediately sensed something was wrong. As he walked through the house, examining the pattern of disarray, he began to notice inconsistencies that troubled him deeply. Books had been knocked off shelves onto the floor, but in a way that seemed staged rather than the result of a frantic search. Drawers were open and items scattered, but nothing of significant value had been taken. Larry's wallet, stuffed with cash, remained in the house. Jewelry and electronics that any burglar would have grabbed remained untouched. Most significantly, Detective Hasty focused his attention on the blood. The pool surrounding Larry's body was substantial, spreading out in a circle approximately 6 inches in all directions. The blood was completely undisturbed, its surface smooth and unbroken. If Rebecca had knelt down and checked Larry's pulse, as she claimed multiple times, there should have been disturbances in that blood, marks where her hands or knees had contacted it. Yet the evidence showed no such contact. Moreover, Rebecca herself had no blood on her hands, her clothes, or her shoes. For someone who claimed to have touched her husband's body, who had checked for a pulse and held him while crying, the complete absence of blood transfer was deeply suspicious. Detective Hasty also questioned the timing of the crime. Why would burglars choose to break into a house on Super Bowl Sunday afternoon, when the chances of people being home were highest? Most burglaries occur when homes are empty, when thieves can work without fear of confrontation. The choice to invade the Fenton home during broad daylight on a day when Larry was almost certain to be watching television seemed illogical unless the intruder specifically wanted Larry to be present. These doubts, combined with Rebecca's behavior during the 911 call and her subsequent interviews, led Detective Hasty to believe he was looking at a staged crime scene and that Rebecca Fenton was not a grieving widow but a calculated killer. As the investigation progressed, more pieces of evidence emerged that pointed away from a random burglary and toward Rebecca as the perpetrator. Larry's missing Jeep Cherokee was discovered, but the search of the vehicle revealed nothing useful. However, when investigators turned their attention to Rebecca's Hyundai Sonata parked in the driveway, they made a discovery that would prove devastating to her claims of innocence. Hidden in a white plastic bag beneath the passenger seat was a collection of items that no innocent person could explain. The bag contained the keys to Larry's Jeep Cherokee, jewelry that Larry always wore, a gun case, and most damningly, a firearm with 5 spent casings. The weapon belonged to both Larry and Rebecca, kept in their home for protection. Forensic analysis would later confirm that the bullets that killed Larry Fenton were fired from this exact gun. A box of ammunition found in their bedroom was missing precisely 5 rounds. The discovery of the murder weapon in Rebecca's car, hidden along with Larry's keys and jewelry, demolished any remaining possibility that an outside intruder had committed the crime. No burglar would have placed these items in Rebecca's vehicle. No random killer would have had access to the Fenton family gun. The evidence pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the house, someone who knew where the gun was kept, someone who had opportunity and means. Detective Hasty became convinced that Rebecca had killed her husband and then staged the burglary to cover her tracks, but proving it would require understanding her motive. Investigators delved into the Fentons' seemingly perfect marriage and discovered fractures beneath the polished surface. Rebecca had been bored and restless, feeling trapped in a lifestyle that lacked the excitement and independence she craved. She had developed feelings for a man named David, a chef at a local restaurant. While both Rebecca and David denied having a physical relationship, they admitted to meeting secretly at a hotel, and Rebecca acknowledged finding him attractive. The emotional affair, even if it remained unconsummated, suggested Rebecca's heart had wandered from her marriage. More significantly, investigators discovered a financial motive that provided a compelling reason for murder. Larry had been cautious when entering his second marriage, and he had insisted on a prenuptial agreement that protected his assets in the event of divorce. If Rebecca left the marriage, or if Larry divorced her, she would receive very little. But the prenup had a crucial exception. If Larry died, Rebecca would inherit approximately $1 million. That sum represented a fortune for a woman who had worked as a nursing assistant and escort, a transformative amount of money that would grant her financial independence and freedom. Prosecutors would later argue that Rebecca decided murder was preferable to divorce, that she chose to kill her husband rather than lose the lifestyle and money she had grown accustomed to enjoying. Despite the mounting evidence and the suspicions of Detective Hasty and his colleagues, Rebecca Fenton was not immediately arrested. The case against her, while compelling, was circumstantial. There were no witnesses to the actual shooting, no confession, no direct evidence placing the gun in her hand at the moment Larry died. Prosecutors wanted more, something that would eliminate reasonable doubt and convince a jury beyond question. They continued investigating, following every lead, hoping for a break that would solidify their case. That break came 6 years later, in 2014, from an unexpected source. A man named Alfred Nolan, who had been in a relationship with Rebecca following Larry's death, contacted police with a chilling claim. According to Nolan, during an argument, Rebecca had threatened him with a knife and said, "I'll kill you like I killed Larry." The statement, if true, was a direct confession. Detective Hasty worked to corroborate Nolan's account, speaking with his nephew and the nephew's girlfriend, both of whom confirmed that Nolan had told them about Rebecca's threat shortly after it occurred. Rebecca would later deny ever making such a statement, claiming that Nolan was lying to obtain a favorable plea deal after she had reported him to police for domestic violence. But the testimony of multiple witnesses gave prosecutors the additional evidence they needed. In 2014, 6 years after Larry Fenton's murder, Rebecca Ayn Fenton was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial that followed would pit the prosecution's narrative of a cold, calculating woman who killed for money against the defense's portrayal of a grieving widow wrongfully accused. Rebecca maintained her innocence throughout, insisting that she had loved Larry deeply, that she had no motive to harm him, and that her life had been far better with him alive than it would be with him dead. She pointed to the lack of gunshot residue on her person, the absence of her DNA in incriminating locations, and the unidentified fingerprints and footprints found at the scene. She argued that she had remained in Florida for 6 full years after the murder rather than fleeing, behavior inconsistent with a guilty conscience. But prosecutors presented a comprehensive case built on the totality of evidence rather than any single piece. They walked the jury through the implausibility of the supposed burglary, the staged appearance of the ransacking, the undisturbed blood pool that contradicted Rebecca's claim of checking for a pulse. They presented the murder weapon found hidden in her car along with Larry's keys and jewelry. They detailed her financial motive, her emotional affair with David, her past as a high-priced call girl that spoke to a woman capable of deception. They played Rebecca's 911 call, highlighting how she had repeated 8 times that she was in the gym, as though anxiously establishing an alibi. Advanced linguistic analysis of her word choices during that call suggested, according to experts, patterns consistent with guilt rather than genuine shock. The jury of 12 Pinellas County residents deliberated for only 2 hours before reaching their verdict. They found Rebecca Ayn Fenton guilty of first-degree murder in the death of her husband Larry. Circuit Judge Joseph Bulon immediately sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At age 48, Rebecca was led away to begin a sentence that would last the rest of her natural life. She would be transferred to Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida, where she remains today. Detective Michael Hasty, who spent years building the case against Rebecca Fenton, he remains absolutely convinced of her guilt, believing that the totality of evidence leaves no reasonable conclusion other than that Rebecca shot her husband 4 times, staged a burglary to cover her tracks, and then performed the role of grieving widow with calculated precision. Sergeant Carrie Spaulding, who worked alongside Hasty on the investigation, shares his certainty, describing Rebecca as a genuine sociopath who believed she would get away with murder and may have convinced herself through repeated lies that her fabricated version of events is real. The case of Rebecca Fenton stands as a disturbing example of how greed and discontent can transform love into violence, how the person who shares your bed and promises devotion can become the architect of your destruction. Larry Fenton worked his entire life to achieve financial success, only to have that success become the motive for his murder. He married a woman he believed loved him, not realizing that she viewed him primarily as a means to an end. On a sunny Super Bowl Sunday, while Americans across the country gathered to watch a game, Larry sat in his living room awaiting pizza and football, unaware that he would never see the opening kickoff, that his wife had decided his death was worth more than his life. Rebecca Fenton will spend the remainder of her days behind bars at Lowell Correctional Institution, maintaining her innocence to anyone who will listen. Whether she is a wrongfully convicted woman or a master manipulator who almost got away with murder depends on whom you believe. The jury made their determination based on the evidence presented to them, and the criminal justice system has rendered its judgment. But Rebecca herself will never admit the truth, will never confess to pulling the trigger 4 times and ending her husband's life in a pool of blood while he watched Tiger Woods on television. The only certainty is that Larry Fenton is dead, his life stolen in his own home, and that someone must answer for that irreversible act of violence. In the eyes of the law, that someone is Rebecca Ann Fenton, and she will pay for her crime with every remaining day of her life. Story 3. The market town of Wisbech sits on the edge of the fens in Cambridgeshire, England, a place where flat agricultural lands stretch to distant horizons, and the modern world exists alongside centuries of history. In January 2013, this quiet community was home to Una Crown, an 86-year-old widow who had spent decades serving her neighbors as a postmistress before retiring to enjoy a quieter chapter of her life. Una was born in the late 1920s, coming of age during World War II, and building her adult life in the post-war years when Britain was reconstructing itself from the devastation of conflict. She married, raised a family, and established herself as a respected member of the Wisbech community through her work at the local post office. For years, she had been the familiar face behind the counter, someone residents relied upon for postal services, friendly conversation, and the small kindnesses that made daily life more pleasant. By 2013, Una had been widowed for some time and lived alone in a bungalow on Magazine Lane, a residential street where neighbors knew one another and looked out for each other in the way small communities do. She had resided there by herself for 4 years, maintaining her independence despite her advancing age. Una was a slight woman, physically vulnerable in the way that octogenarians often are, but she remained active and engaged with life. She maintained regular contact with family members and friends, spoke on the telephone with loved ones, and kept appointments for social occasions. Her niece Judith Payne and Judith's husband John lived nearby and stayed in close contact with Una. On Sundays, they often collected her for lunch, providing both companionship and an opportunity to ensure their elderly relative was well. These weekly visits represented the kind of family care that allowed Una to maintain her independence while knowing that help was available if she needed it. Living just a few streets away on Magazine Close was David Newton, a man in his late 50s who worked as a kitchen fitter and handyman. Newton had performed odd jobs for various residents in the area, presenting himself as someone willing to help elderly neighbors with tasks that had become difficult for them to manage alone. At some point, Newton had done work for Una, helping her with a lock on her back door. The job should have been straightforward and temporary, a brief professional interaction that ended when the work was completed. But Newton had done something that Una did not know about and would not discover until it was too late. When he worked on her lock, he had secretly made a copy of her back door key, creating unauthorized access to her home. This violation of trust would remain hidden for months, a silent threat lurking beneath the surface of ordinary neighborhood life. The truth was that Newton had developed a pattern of behavior that should have raised concerns among those who knew him. He had a habit of entering other people's properties uninvited, searching for conversation and company in ways that violated normal boundaries. He would show up unannounced, make himself comfortable in homes that were not his own, and impose his presence on individuals who had not invited him. On the evening of January 12, 2013, Newton had been drinking heavily, that he had been intoxicated that night, calling elderly women on the telephone and pestering them with unwanted contact. His behavior suggested someone whose judgment was impaired, whose inhibitions had been lowered by alcohol, whose capacity to respect boundaries had been further diminished. Una Crown spent that Saturday engaged in her normal routines. She had last been seen on Friday, January 11th, going about her daily activities. On Saturday evening, at approximately 5 o'clock, she spoke with a friend on the telephone, a conversation that would become significant when investigators later tried to establish the timeline of her final hours. The call was routine, the kind of casual check-in that friends make with one another. Una gave no indication that anything was wrong, no hint that she felt threatened or afraid. When the conversation ended, Una hung up the phone and continued with her evening, unaware that she had only hours left to live. Sometime after that phone call, likely later that same evening, David Newton used the key he had secretly copied months earlier and let himself into Una's bungalow through the back door. He entered uninvited, violating the sanctuary of Una's home without her knowledge or consent. Whether he intended only to seek companionship, whether he planned to steal from the elderly widow, or whether darker impulses drove him that night remains unclear. What is certain is that Una discovered him in her home, and the encounter escalated into confrontation. The evidence of Una's telephone, found hanging off its cradle after her body was discovered, suggested that she had attempted to call for help when she realized an intruder was in her house. Perhaps she recognized Newton and demanded to know what he was doing there. Perhaps she threatened to report him to the police. Whatever words passed between them, Newton's response was to reach for violence. He grabbed a knife from Una's own kitchen, transforming a household implement into a weapon. Then he attacked the elderly woman with ferocious brutality. Una, frail and defenseless at 86 years old, tried to fight back. She raised her hands in defense, struggling against her attacker even as he overpowered her. Her fingernails scraped against Newton's skin, collecting DNA evidence that would remain hidden under the surface for more than a decade. Newton slashed Una's throat with the knife, inflicting a wound so deep that it would have been immediately life-threatening. But he did not stop there. He stabbed her 4 times in the chest, driving the blade into her body with such force that one wound passed completely through her torso, entering from the left side, penetrating both lungs and her heart, and exiting on the right side. The attack was sustained and merciless, each thrust of the knife a deliberate act against a woman who posed no physical threat to anyone. Una Crown died in the hallway of her own home, surrounded by blood, her body bearing the marks of a frenzied assault. She must have been terrified in those final moments, unable to comprehend why someone was doing this to her, unable to defend herself against the violence being inflicted upon her small frame. The physical suffering would have been immense, but so too would have been the psychological anguish of dying at the hands of someone she had allowed to help her, someone she had trusted to do work in her home. After Una was dead, Newton attempted to destroy evidence of what he had done. He set 3 small fires inside the bungalow, using newspaper as kindling. He burned Una's clothing in an apparent effort to eliminate forensic traces that might connect him to the crime. He set fire to her body itself, trying to incinerate the evidence of his attack. The flames consumed portions of Una's remains, charring her flesh and destroying her left hand completely. But Newton was not an expert arsonist. The fires he set were small and poorly executed. They burned newspapers and clothing, they damaged Una's body, but they did not spread to the rest of the house. The fires self-extinguished, going out on their own before they could consume the bungalow or completely destroy the evidence Newton sought to eliminate. Una's right hand, protected from the flames, remained largely intact, preserving beneath her fingernails the DNA that would eventually lead to Newton's conviction. Before leaving Una's home, Newton stole from the woman he had just murdered. He took her wedding ring, removing from her finger the symbol of her marriage and her life with the husband she had lost. He took 40 pounds in cash from her handbag, money that belonged to Una and that Newton had no right to possess. He also took Una's front door key, perhaps hoping to make the crime appear to be a burglary by an outside intruder rather than someone who had unauthorized access through the back entrance. The following day, Sunday, January 13th, Newton was seen spending money freely at the Wisbech Ex-Servicemen's Club. He visited twice that day, playing fruit machines and behaving as if nothing had happened, as if he had not brutally murdered an elderly woman less than 24 hours earlier. The 80 pounds he had stolen from Una, the 40 from her handbag plus additional money prosecutors believed he took, funded his entertainment at the club, while Una's body lay undiscovered in her bungalow just streets away. That same Sunday, John Payne drove to Una's home to collect her for their regular Sunday lunch. He rang the doorbell and waited for her to answer. When she did not respond, concern began to build. Una was reliable about their Sunday arrangements. She always answered her door when family came to collect her. John tried again, knocking and calling out, but silence greeted his efforts. Eventually, John gained access to the house and made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Una's body lay in the hallway, surrounded by pools of blood. Burned newspaper littered the floor around her. The smell of smoke lingered in the air. Her clothing had been burned away, and portions of her body showed evidence of fire damage. It was a scene of horror, violence, and attempted destruction that no family member should ever have to witness. Emergency services were called immediately. Police officers arrived at Magazine Lane along with firefighters and paramedics, though it was clear that no medical intervention could help Una now. The first officers on the scene made a decision that would have profound consequences for the investigation. They concluded that Una's death was not suspicious. Despite the blood, despite the neck wound, despite the evidence of fire, they determined that the death was unexplained rather than criminal. This catastrophic error of judgment meant that Una's home was not treated as a crime scene. Police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and eventually undertakers moved through the bungalow without the protocols that normally preserve evidence in a murder investigation. People touched surfaces, walked through rooms, and even handled Una's body, potentially contaminating or destroying forensic evidence that might have been crucial to solving the case. Just 5.5 hours after Una's body was discovered, undertakers were arranged to remove her remains from the house. The scene was being dismantled before anyone had properly examined it, before anyone had recognized what had really happened in that hallway on Magazine Lane. It was not until Tuesday, January 15th, 2 full days after Una's body was found, that the truth became undeniable. A post-mortem examination was conducted, and when mortuary assistants observed the extent of Una's injuries, responsibility for the assessment was transferred to a forensic pathologist. The pathologist's examination revealed what should have been obvious from the beginning. Una Crown had been murdered. She had died from multiple stab wounds to her neck and chest. Her throat had been cut. 4 separate stab wounds penetrated her torso, one passing completely through her body. These were not injuries that could have been self-inflicted or accidental. This was homicide, and the 2-day delay in recognizing it as such had allowed crucial evidence to be lost or compromised. The investigation was immediately upgraded to a murder inquiry. Detectives from Cambridgeshire Police launched an intensive effort to solve the case, but they were working at a disadvantage. The crime scene had been compromised. Evidence had been contaminated or destroyed. The initial failure to recognize Una's death as suspicious had given any potential suspect 2 additional days to cover their tracks and dispose of evidence. Less than 3 weeks after Una's murder, on February 1st, 2013, police arrested David Newton on suspicion of murder. He was taken into custody and questioned about his relationship with Una and his whereabouts on the night she died. But without sufficient evidence to charge him, Newton was released. He walked free, returning to his life in Wisbech while Una's family grieved and investigators struggled to build a case against him. The years passed with agonizing slowness for Una's family. Regular appeals for witnesses and information were made, but no charges were brought. The case remained open but unsolved, one of thousands of investigations where police know who they suspect, but lack the evidence necessary to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Then, in October 2022, nearly a decade after Una's murder, Cambridgeshire police decided to review the case using new forensic technology. Advances in DNA testing techniques had made it possible to analyze smaller samples and extract genetic profiles from evidence that earlier methods could not process. Among the items preserved from the crime scene were fingernail clippings taken from Una's right hand, the hand that had not been destroyed by fire. Forensic scientists applied the new testing methods to these nail clippings, searching for any trace evidence that might have been trapped beneath Una's fingernails when she fought against her attacker. The results were conclusive and damning. Male DNA was found under Una's fingernails, and the genetic profile matched David Newton. This was the breakthrough investigators had needed for more than a decade. The DNA evidence placed Newton at the scene of Una's murder and directly contradicted his claims that he had not seen Una on or around the day she died. He could no longer maintain that he had only known her in passing, that he had no connection to her death. His genetic material, preserved beneath her fingernails for more than 10 years, proved he had been there when she fought for her life. In April 2024, police arrested David Newton for the second time. He was 69 years old now, having lived more than 11 years of freedom after murdering Una Crown. This time, the evidence was sufficient to charge him. He was formally indicted for murder and remanded to await trial. The trial began in January 2025 at Cambridge Crown Court, 12 years after Una's death. Prosecutor John Price presented the case to the jury, walking them through the timeline of Una's final day, the evidence found at the scene, and the DNA breakthrough that had finally connected Newton to the crime. He described the police errors that had compromised the initial investigation, but emphasized that despite those failures, justice could still be served. Newton maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, denying that he had murdered Una Crown. But the evidence spoke for itself. The DNA under her fingernails, the copy of her back door key he had secretly made, his pattern of entering other people's homes uninvited, his heavy drinking on the night of the murder, his free spending on the day Una's body was discovered, the timeline that placed him in Una's home when she was killed. The trial lasted 4 weeks. On February 13, 2025, after more than 29 hours of deliberations over 6 days, the jury returned their verdict. By a majority of 10-2, they found David Newton guilty of murdering Una Crown. The following day, February 14, 2025, Newton appeared before Mr. Justice Neil Garnham for sentencing. The judge addressed Newton directly, his words capturing the horror of what had been done to Una Crown. This was a ferocious and sustained knife attack on a defenseless old lady in her own home, Justice Garnham stated. He noted that Una must have been utterly terrified when Newton entered her house that evening, that she must have experienced considerable mental and physical anguish before her death. The judge sentenced Newton to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years before he would be eligible for parole. At 70 years old, Newton would be 91 before he could even be considered for release, effectively ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Detective Superintendent Michael Moore of Cambridgeshire Police spoke after the sentencing, acknowledging the mistakes made in the initial investigation, but emphasizing that persistence and advances in forensic science had ultimately delivered justice. For more than a decade, he thought he had gotten away with this most horrendous crime, but today's result shows you cannot hide forever, Moore stated. Una Crown's family released a statement expressing relief that they could finally carry on with their lives knowing justice had been done. They thanked the police and prosecutors for their dedication to solving Una's murder, even when the case seemed cold and unsolvable. The case stands as both a cautionary tale about the importance of properly processing crime scenes and a testament to the power of perseverance in criminal investigations. Una Crown was a woman who deserved to live out her final years in peace and dignity, secure in the home she had made for herself after her husband's death. Instead, she died in terror and pain, murdered by someone she had allowed into her life, someone who violated her trust in the most profound way possible. Story 4. The city of Solingen, nestled in North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany, had always been a place where families went about their lives quietly, unassumingly, in the manner of countless small cities across Europe. The apartment blocks stood shoulder to shoulder in the Hasseldel district, their windows looking out onto modest streets where children played and neighbors greeted one another with familiar nods. In one of these apartments lived a family of 7, a mother named Christiane K., and her 6 children, ranging from a baby barely 1 year old to an 11-year-old boy who was approaching adolescence. To the outside world, they appeared to be just another family navigating the challenges of daily life, their struggles hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. But on the morning of September 3rd, 2020, something unimaginable shattered the quiet normalcy of that apartment, transforming it into a scene that would shock not only Germany but people around the world. The tragedy that unfolded within those walls would force an entire nation to confront questions about the depths of human desperation, the fragility of the maternal bond, and the devastating consequences when anger and pain eclipse reason. Christiane K. was 27 years old, a woman whose life had taken difficult turns. She was the mother of 6 children, 5 daughters and sons who depended on her for everything, and an eldest boy who had become her helper as she struggled to manage a household that often felt overwhelming. Her relationship with the children's father had deteriorated and eventually ended, leaving her to raise the children largely on her own. The weight of single parenthood pressed heavily on her shoulders, and the emotional toll of a failed relationship added layers of bitterness and resentment that she carried with her through each exhausting day. In the days leading up to that September morning, Christiane had received something that ignited a rage within her, a photograph. It was an image of her former partner, the father of her children, standing with a new woman, smiling with an ease and happiness that felt like a cruel betrayal. For Christiane, the photograph represented not just the end of their relationship, but the confirmation that he had moved on, that he was capable of joy while she remained trapped in the relentless cycle of caring for their children alone. The anger that surged through her was visceral and all-consuming, a toxic mixture of jealousy, abandonment, and a desire to inflict pain as profound as what she felt herself. In her fury, Christiane sent a message to her former partner, words typed with trembling fingers that carried a terrible promise. "You will never see your children again." It was a declaration born of rage, but within hours, those words would transform from a threat into a horrifying reality. On that Thursday morning, as the city of Solingen began its daily routine, Christiane set into motion a plan that defied comprehension. She prepared breakfast for her children, Melina, Leonie, Sophie, Timo, and Luca, aged between 1 and 8 years old. The children likely ate without suspicion, trusting their mother as all children do, unaware that she had mixed medication into their drinks to make them sleepy. The drugs worked quickly, and one by one, the children grew drowsy, their small bodies succumbing to the sedatives as their mother watched. But before the terrible sequence of events began in earnest, Christiane made one exception: her eldest child, an 11-year-old boy who had been spared the drugged breakfast. She sent him away to stay with his grandmother, removing him from the apartment before the unthinkable took place. Whether this was an act of selective mercy, a recognition of his age, or simply a practical decision to ensure he would not interfere, the boy's absence would prove to be the only thing that saved his life that day. With the eldest child safely away, Christiane turned her attention to the 5 younger children who remained. In the quiet of the apartment, with the children sedated and defenseless, she carried out acts that would later be described in court as malicious murders. Prosecutors would allege that she took each child, one by one, to the bathroom, where she either drowned them in the bathtub or suffocated them, ending their lives with a methodical determination that suggested a complete emotional detachment from the reality of what she was doing. Melina, just 1 year old, had barely begun to explore the world. Leonie and Sophie, at 2 and 3, were toddlers full of curiosity and laughter. Timo at 6 and Luca at 8 were old enough to have memories, friendships, and dreams of their own. After each child died, Christian wrapped their small bodies in towels and placed them on their beds, arranging them as though they were simply sleeping. The apartment at 11:45 in the morning held an eerie stillness, the silence broken only by the faint sounds of the city outside, a stark contrast to the violence that had just occurred within those walls. With her children lying lifeless in their beds, Christiane left the apartment and made her way to the Dusseldorf train station, approximately 30 kilometers away. There, in what appeared to be an attempt to escape the consequences of her actions, or perhaps to silence the unbearable guilt and horror of what she had done, she threw herself in front of an oncoming train. Bystanders screamed, the train's brakes screeched, and emergency responders rushed to the scene. Miraculously, Christiane survived, though she sustained serious injuries. She was pulled from the tracks and taken to a hospital, where doctors worked to stabilize her condition. Meanwhile, back in Solingen, the grandmother who had taken in the eldest boy grew increasingly concerned. The boy had mentioned something troubling, or perhaps the grandmother had simply felt an inexplicable sense of dread. She contacted the authorities, and police were dispatched to the apartment in the Hasseldell district. What they found when they entered the home was a scene of unimaginable tragedy. 5 children, each wrapped in a towel, lying still and silent on their beds. The officers stood in shocked silence, struggling to process the reality of what they were witnessing. The news spread quickly through Solingen and beyond, rippling across Germany and eventually reaching international media. People reacted with disbelief and horror, unable to comprehend how a mother could kill her own children. The case dominated headlines, sparking conversations about mental health, the pressures of single parenthood, and the warning signs that might have been missed. As Christiane recovered from her injuries in the hospital, she was placed under arrest and charged with 5 counts of murder. Investigators pieced together the timeline of that terrible day, gathering evidence from the apartment, interviewing the grandmother and the eldest child, and examining Christiane's communications with her former partner. The photograph that had triggered her rage was found, along with the message she had sent threatening that he would never see his children again. It became clear to prosecutors that the killings had been motivated by anger and a desire for revenge, a way to inflict the deepest possible pain on a man who had moved on without her. When the trial began in the regional court in Wuppertal, Western Germany, the courtroom was filled with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who wanted to understand how such a tragedy could have occurred. Christiane K., now 28 years old, sat in the defendant's seat, her demeanor closely watched by all in attendance. She maintained her innocence, offering a defense that strained credulity. She claimed that a masked intruder had entered the apartment, tied her up, and killed her children while she was helpless to intervene. It was a story that investigators quickly dismissed, as there was no physical evidence to support her claim. No signs of forced entry, no bindings, no witnesses, and no logical explanation for why such an attack would have occurred. The prosecution presented a case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the digital trail of messages Christiane had sent in the hours before the killings. They described her actions as calculated and malicious, emphasizing that she had taken advantage of her children's innocence and their complete dependence on her. The children had been sedated, rendering them unable to resist or even understand what was happening to them. The prosecutors argued that Christiane had acted with full awareness of her actions, driven by a toxic combination of rage and narcissism. Court-appointed psychological experts examined Christiane to determine whether she could be held criminally responsible for her actions. Their findings revealed that while she had been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, a condition characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy for others, she did not suffer from a serious mental illness that would have rendered her incapable of understanding right from wrong. The experts concluded that she was fully competent to stand trial and to be held accountable for the murders. The defense attempted to argue for an acquittal, but the evidence against Christiane was overwhelming. Judge Johan Cotter, presiding over the case, described it as a tragedy that had left an indelible mark on the community and the nation. The victims, Melina, Leonie, Sophie, Timo, and Luca, were remembered not as statistics or case numbers, but as individual children whose lives had been stolen from them before they had the chance to grow and flourish. On November 4th, 2021, after careful deliberation, the court delivered its verdict. Christian K. was found guilty of 5 counts of murder. The judges determined that the crimes had been committed with particular gravity, a legal designation in Germany that reflects the especially heinous nature of an offense. This determination carried significant consequences for sentencing, as it meant that Christian would not be eligible for parole after the standard 15 years that is typical for life sentences in Germany. Instead, she would serve a life sentence with the understanding that her release, if it ever came, would be far in the future. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. Christian showed little visible emotion, a response that some interpreted as further evidence of the narcissistic detachment that had characterized her throughout the trial. For the families of the victims, particularly the grandmother who had raised the alarm and the eldest boy who had been spared, the verdict brought no real comfort, only the cold acknowledgement that justice, in its limited capacity, had been served. The case left deep scars on the city of Solingen, a community that had already endured tragedy in its history. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the quiet woman they had occasionally seen with her children with the person capable of such unfathomable violence. Mental health professionals and child welfare advocates called for better support systems for struggling parents, hoping that future tragedies might be prevented through early intervention and accessible resources. For the eldest boy, now without his mother and siblings, the path forward was unimaginably difficult. He had been spared the physical violence of that September morning, but the emotional and psychological trauma of losing his entire family in such a brutal manner would be a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. The grandmother who had taken him in that day became his guardian, providing what stability and love she could in the aftermath of such profound loss. The case of Christian K. serves as a haunting reminder of the destructive power of unchecked rage and the vulnerability of children who depend entirely on the adults in their lives. It raises uncomfortable questions about the pressures faced by single parents, the impact of personality disorders on behavior, and the limits of societal structures designed to protect the most vulnerable. The 5 children, Melina, Leonie, Sophie, Timo, and Luca, are remembered not for the manner of their deaths, but for the lives they should have been allowed to live, the milestones they should have reached, and the potential that was extinguished far too soon. In the quiet apartment in Solingen where the tragedy unfolded, the rooms have since fallen silent, a space that once held the sounds of children playing and laughing now empty. The city has moved forward, as cities must, but the memory of what happened there remains, a somber testament to the fragility of safety and the irreversible consequences of actions taken in moments of darkness. For those who followed the case, the image of 5 small bodies wrapped in towels, arranged on their beds as though sleeping, is one that will not easily fade, a stark and terrible reminder that evil can sometimes wear the most familiar of faces. Story 5. Heather Danielle Teague was 23 years old when she vanished, a young Kentucky woman with brown hair, green eyes, a slight frame, and a life that should have stretched much farther than one summer afternoon beside the Ohio River. On August 26, 1995, she went to Newburgh Beach in rural Henderson County, Kentucky, across the water from Newburgh, Indiana, and what happened there would become one of the most haunting unsolved disappearances in the region. The case has always carried a strange, almost impossible quality, as if it were split between 2 shores from the beginning. Heather was on the Kentucky side, alone on a beach, while the person who would become the most important eyewitness was on the Indiana side, looking through a telescope from his home across the river. That distance matters because it turned a terrible act into something both vividly seen and maddeningly unreachable, a crime witnessed in daylight yet never fully explained. Before she disappeared, Heather was simply a young woman spending part of an August day by the water. The records that remain tell us practical things about her. She was born on April 25, 1972. She stood about 5'1", weighed roughly 90 to 100 pounds, and had distinctive physical features including scoliosis and a red birthmark on her right buttock. Those details, preserved in missing person files, have the cold precision of official paperwork, but behind them is the far more painful truth that every measurement belonged to someone loved, recognized, and expected home. Newburgh Beach was not a place built for legend. It was a riverbank in a rural part of Henderson County, the kind of place where a car could be parked, a towel spread out, and an ordinary day could pass almost unnoticed by the wider world. That ordinariness is part of what makes the case so unsettling, because nothing about Heather's plans suggested that she was walking into the center of a mystery that would outlast decades. At some point that afternoon, a man named Tim Walthall was looking across the river through a telescope from the Indiana side. What he later reported was not uncertain in its basic outline. He said he saw a man approach Heather, possibly holding a gun, grab her by the hair, and drag her into the nearby woods. In later descriptions tied to the case, the suspect was described as shaggy-haired, possibly bearded, though questions would arise over whether what the witness saw was actual hair and facial hair, or something like netting or a wig. That moment is the fixed point around which every other question still turns. A beach, a woman alone, a man coming out of the edge of the trees, and then movement so violent and sudden that a stranger across the river understood he was watching something terribly wrong. Walthall later said he called police after Heather did not come back from the woods after about 25 minutes, a detail that gives the scene an awful sense of suspended time, as if the world held its breath before realizing she was not returning. When investigators reached the area, Heather was gone. Police found some of the things that proved she had been there, including her towel, her notebook, and part of her swimsuit, while other reports say pieces of her bathing suit were found near the wooded area by the abduction site. The objects left behind made the beach feel less like a place of leisure and more like an interrupted sentence, a life paused in the middle of a day that never resumed. Heather herself was never found. Search efforts followed, and later reporting described authorities using dogs and helicopters while recovering personal items, but not the young woman they were looking for. From the earliest hours, the case carried both urgency and dread, because the evidence at the scene suggested not a disappearance into thin air, but a forceful removal witnessed by someone who could do nothing to stop it. The investigation moved quickly toward leads connected to a vehicle seen in the area. According to case summaries, a local farmer who was videotaping crop vandalism that day captured Heather's car, and, down the road, a Ford Bronco and registration checks helped investigators develop a primary suspect who drove a Bronco and had a criminal history. In a story already full of unsettling angles, this was one of the first threads that seemed to offer police a direct path from the beach to a specific man. That man was Marvin Ray Marty Dill. WDRB later reported that the description of the suspect matched Dill's driver's license photo and that his truck had been seen near the beach, facts that helped fix attention on him very early in the case. Once his name entered the story, it changed the emotional shape of the investigation, because the mystery seemed to narrow from a faceless figure in the trees to someone local, someone reachable, someone the police might confront. But the confrontation that followed did not bring Heather home, and it did not settle the case. 5 days after Heather disappeared, when police came to Dill's home to serve a search warrant or question him, he fatally shot himself before authorities could arrest or interview him. His death created the kind of silence that can harden around a case for years, because a man many believed could explain what happened was suddenly beyond all questioning. For a time, that silence seemed to encourage a grim simplicity. Heather's mother, Sarah Teague, later said the family had been told Marty Dill did it, and for years that was what they believed. In many investigations, a suspect's death can act like a door closing, not because every fact is known, but because institutions and communities begin to behave as though the broad shape of the truth is already settled. Yet Heather's case never truly settled. Kentucky State Police have said the investigation remains open, and WDRB reported that police never found Heather's body and never officially closed the case around Dill. That distinction matters because unofficial certainty and official proof are not the same thing, and in this case the gap between them grew wider as the years passed. Even the witness description that had pointed so strongly toward Dill began to look less secure under later scrutiny. According to WDRB, Dill's family and jail records indicated that he had a shaved head and no beard at the time of the abduction, which did not fit the image of a bushy-haired, bearded man seen from across the river. The same report said an FBI interview in 2006 with another witness also suggested Dill had a shaved head and no facial hair 2 weeks before Heather vanished. That mismatch did not erase suspicion, but it fractured the apparent neatness of the original theory. Sarah Teague came to believe that the witness may have changed or refined his description only after learning that Dill had been bald and clean-shaven at the time, and she argued in court that authorities would not admit this contradiction plainly. What had once seemed like a solved shape, without a solved body, began to feel instead like a story with missing pages and overwritten lines. The 911 call became one of the most painful and contested pieces of that story. Sarah Teague said that in 2008 she and her attorney were allowed to hear what police said was Tim Walthall's call, and in that version he described the suspect in a way that allowed for bushy hair and a beard or possibly mosquito netting or a wig. Then, according to WDRB, in 2016 a different Kentucky State Police detective let Teague and her attorney hear what they said was a very different 911 call, one in which the witness did not mention netting or a wig. To Sarah, that difference was devastating. She told the court the call she heard in 2008 was not the call to a dispatcher she heard in 2016, and her attorney argued that state police were actively withholding information and covering up parts of the evidence tied to the abduction. Whether those discrepancies came from error, mishandling, multiple recordings, or something else, the effect was to deepen the family's grief with doubt, forcing them to question not only what happened on the beach, but also what had been preserved about it afterward. The courts eventually agreed that the police had no sound basis for keeping some of those records from Heather's mother. An appeals court upheld a judgment against Kentucky State Police after Sarah Teague sued in 2016 over an open records request related to the 911 call, and the court said police had wrongfully kept records from her and should pay her legal costs. WDRB also reported that a judge found KSP had acted in conscious disregard of Teague's rights and ordered the agency to pay about $25,000 in attorney fees, penalties, and court costs. Those legal rulings did not solve the disappearance, but they changed the moral landscape around it. The story was no longer only about a young woman taken from a beach. It was also about a mother spending decades trying to prise information loose from an institution that insisted the case was still active while resisting disclosure about one of its most important pieces of evidence. In that sense, the case developed a second narrative beside the first, one about endurance, records, hearings, affidavits, and the exhausting labor of refusing to let uncertainty harden into official habit. As Sarah fought for answers, other unsettling details surfaced through records and reporting. WDRB said partial FBI records from the mid-2000s described the case in ways that did not fully match the eyewitness account, including a memo that said Heather was last seen at a boat ramp, not on the beach, 2 hours after the key witness called police. The same reporting said heavily redacted FBI documents suggested more than one person may have been involved in Heather's disappearance, and raised the possibility of links involving drugs, prostitution, public corruption, or even a witness protection context. Those claims did not bring clarity, so much as they widened the darkness around the case. They suggested that what happened to Heather might not fit the simplest version that had circulated for years, and they implied that investigators themselves may have been operating inside a more complicated web of concerns than the public understood. WDRB also reported that a 2007 FBI synopsis mentioned that something was being kept a secret by Kentucky State Police and that no family member or attorney was aware of it, a detail that naturally sharpened Sarah Teague's suspicion that vital truths had been withheld. Another possible suspect entered the edges of the story as well. WDRB reported that, at one point, police in Ohio investigating a different Henderson man, Chris Below, in the confessed 1991 murder of his girlfriend, considered whether he might also have been involved in Heather's abduction because he had been in the area at the time. Below denied involvement in Heather's disappearance, and the case did not resolve around him either, leaving his role, if any, unproven and uncertain. That is one of the defining sorrows of the Heather Teague case. Every path seems to begin with force and urgency, then fade into contradiction, silence, or incompleteness. The witness saw something dreadful, but distance and later discrepancies complicated the description. The police developed a prime suspect, but he died before questioning, and Heather was never found. Records existed, but access to them became a battle. Leads emerged, but none closed the wound. Meanwhile, time did what time always does in unsolved cases. It kept moving while the missing stayed the same age in photographs. WDRB described one room in Sarah Teague's home as filled with Heather's clothing, stuffed animals, and thousands of documents about the case. A private archive built out of love, memory, and refusal. There is something almost unbearably human in that image, because it shows a mother trying to hold back disappearance itself, preserving both her daughter's belongings and the paper trail of every hope, every contradiction, every reason not to stop. The official record still classifies Heather as endangered missing, with foul play suspected and her DNA available in Cody's. That language is clinical, but it means the essential fact has never changed. Heather did not leave voluntarily, and the system still recognizes the violent likelihood at the heart of her disappearance. She remains not a mystery in the abstract, but a missing woman whose absence began in a visible act of terror and has never been repaired. In 2025, nearly 30 years after the abduction, the case entered another remarkable chapter. Kentucky State Police exhumed the body of Marty Dill to collect DNA for comparison in the Heather Teague investigation, a step that reflected both the persistence of the case and the fact that earlier assumptions had not satisfied everyone involved. Reporting at the time said the exhumation was carried out for DNA purposes connected to evidence in the case, and authorities did not provide a final timeline for when analysis results might be available. That development carried a heavy irony. For years, Dill had lived in public imagination as the answer, or at least the nearest thing to one. Yet 3 decades later, investigators were still forced to return to his remains and ask science to speak where the living no longer could. It was not closure, but it was an acknowledgement that the old certainty had never been complete enough to end the questions. By then, Sarah Teague had spent almost 30 years in public struggle with the institutions that were supposed to help her. Reporting around the exhumation noted her long fight for answers and her repeated insistence that definitive DNA testing could either link Dill to the case or exclude him. Even at that late stage, the investigation seemed suspended between 2 impulses: the pressure to confirm a long-held theory and the responsibility to admit, if the evidence required it, that the truth might lie elsewhere. Most striking about Heather's story is not only its violence, but its incompleteness. We know she went to the beach on August 26, 1995. We know a witness across the river said he saw a man with a gun drag her by the hair into the woods. We know police found belongings at the scene, pursued a suspect, and never found Heather. We know her mother has spent years fighting for records, challenging the official narrative, and insisting that the case contains facts still not fully told. Everything beyond that lives in the tense space between evidence and absence. Was Marty Dill the man on the beach, as early suspicion and some witness certainty suggested, or did the physical description and later questions about evidence point away from him? Did the case involve more than one person, as redacted FBI documents seem to indicate, or did years of confusion simply layer speculation over a terrible but simpler crime? Was the truth lost in the first days, buried in conflicting recollections, damaged evidence, or institutional defensiveness, or has it remained present all along, waiting for one honest disclosure or one conclusive test to bring it into the light. For the public, cases like this often become puzzles. For families, they are not puzzles at all. They are daily injuries measured in birthdays, court dates, anniversaries, unopened answers, and the terrible discipline of hope. Heather Teague was 23 when she disappeared, and every year since has only deepened the contrast between the short span of her known life and the long stretch of uncertainty left behind. That may be the truest way to understand the case from beginning to end. It began in ordinary daylight, with a young woman by a riverbank. It broke open in a moment of violence witnessed from across the water. It moved through search efforts, suspicion, a suspect's suicide, decades of official ambiguity, courtroom fights over records, troubling FBI references, and the later exhumation of the man long tied to the case. And it ends, for now, not with resolution, but with the same ache that has shadowed it since 1995. Heather Teague has never been found, and the question of what happened to her remains painfully, stubbornly alive. Story 6. In the early months of 2015, a young woman with dreams as bright as her smile arrived in Glasgow, Scotland, ready to begin a new chapter in her life. Karen Buckley, 24 years old and radiating the kind of optimism that comes with purpose, had traveled from her hometown of Cork, Ireland, to pursue a master's degree in occupational therapy at Glasgow Caledonian University. She had already accomplished so much in her short life, having graduated from the University of Limerick with a degree in general nursing just over a year earlier. Before making the move to Scotland, she had worked as a qualified nurse at the Princess Royal Hospital, gaining experience and touching lives with her gentle manner and dedication to helping others. Karen was the kind of person who lit up a room. Her family and friends described her as warm, caring, and full of dreams. She had moved to Glasgow in February 2015, and though she had been in the city for only a few months, she was already building a new life. She shared a flat with friends, attended her university classes with enthusiasm, and on weekends, like many young people her age, she enjoyed going out with her new social circle to experience the vibrant nightlife Glasgow had to offer. Her parents, still back in Ireland, were immensely proud of their daughter's achievements and ambitions. They had watched her grow into a compassionate, determined young woman, and they had every reason to believe her future was limitless. Saturday, April 11th, 2015, began like any other weekend evening for Karen. She made plans to go out with her friends to the Sanctuary, a popular nightclub located on Dumbarton Road in Glasgow's West End. The atmosphere was lively, filled with music, laughter, and the hum of conversation. Karen, dressed casually and carrying only her essentials, blended into the crowd of young people seeking to unwind after a long week. She danced with her friends, enjoyed the music, and appeared to be having a good time. Everything about the evening seemed ordinary, unremarkable even. There was no indication that this night would be any different from countless others before it. But elsewhere in Glasgow that same evening, another young person was preparing for a night out. Alexander Pacto, a 21-year-old man from Bearsden, an affluent suburb of Glasgow, had invited a group of friends to his flat before heading to the Sanctuary. Pacto came from a comfortable background and ran a small courier company. On the surface, he appeared to be just another young man enjoying his weekend. He and his friends spent the evening drinking at his apartment before arranging transportation to the nightclub. When only one taxi arrived instead of two, Pacto drove half the group to the club in his silver Ford Focus, while the others took the taxi. He parked his car and entered the nightclub, blending into the same crowd where Karen was spending her evening. What happened in the early hours of Sunday, April 12th, would transform this ordinary night into a nightmare. Sometime after midnight, Karen told her friends she needed to use the restroom. It was a casual remark, the kind exchanged 100 times on any night out. Her friends thought nothing of it. They continued dancing, assuming she would return in a few minutes. But Karen never came back. She left her jacket behind in the club, a detail that would later become significant. Outside the Sanctuary, on Dumbarton Road, security cameras captured Karen leaving the nightclub alone around 1 o'clock in the morning. The footage showed her standing on the street, and then moments later, a man approached her. The cameras recorded them talking, their conversation brief and seemingly ordinary. The man was Alexander Pacto, though at that moment, no one knew his identity. Whatever was said between them, Karen agreed to get into his silver Ford Focus. Perhaps she believed he was offering her a lift home. Perhaps she thought he seemed harmless, trustworthy even. Young women make these calculations every day, weighing risks in split-second decisions. Karen made her choice, opened the car door, and climbed inside. The vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the Glasgow night. Pacto drove his car just a short distance to Kelvin Way, a quiet street not far from the nightclub. Security cameras tracked the Ford Focus as it turned onto the road and came to a stop. For 12 minutes, the car remained parked on that street, its interior hidden from view, its windows revealing nothing of what was happening inside. But in those 12 terrible minutes, Karen Buckley's life came to a violent and senseless end. Inside the vehicle, Alexander Pacto attacked her with a level of brutality that defied comprehension. He grabbed her throat, cutting off her air, strangling her as she struggled. Then, producing a spanner he had brought with him, he began to strike her head repeatedly, delivering 12 or 13 heavy blows with savage force. The impacts fractured her skull and caused subdural hemorrhaging. Karen fought for her life in those desperate moments, but she stood no chance against the ferocity and determination of her attacker. When the violence finally ceased, Karen Buckley was dead. She had entered that car a vibrant, hopeful young woman with her entire future ahead of her. 12 minutes later, she was gone, her life extinguished by a stranger's hands for reasons that made no sense and never would. The security cameras recorded Pacto's Ford Focus leaving Kelvin Way and driving toward Dawsholm Park. Inside the vehicle, Karen's body lay lifeless. Pacto's mind was already calculating his next moves, already beginning the process of concealment and deception that would follow. The following morning, Sunday, April 12th, a member of the public walking through Dawsholm Park made a disturbing discovery near a rubbish bin. It was a handbag, and inside it were items belonging to Karen Buckley. The bag had been discarded, thrown away like refuse. But Karen herself was nowhere to be found. Back at her flat, her friends and roommates were growing increasingly worried. Karen had not returned home after the night out. She had not answered her phone. This was completely unlike her. Karen was responsible, considerate, the type of person who always let people know where she was. Her absence felt wrong, deeply wrong. Later that day, Karen's friends contacted Police Scotland to report her missing. What began as a missing person case quickly escalated into something far more serious. The police launched a wide-scale operation, mobilizing resources and officers across Glasgow. They reviewed security footage from the sanctuary and the surrounding streets, and that was when they found the crucial images. Karen leaving the nightclub, talking to an unidentified man on Dumbarton Road, and getting into a silver Ford Focus. The police released screenshots from the CCTV footage to the public, appealing for anyone who recognized the man or the vehicle to come forward. The images spread rapidly across news outlets and social media. Glasgow, and soon all of Scotland and Ireland, became gripped by the mystery of Karen Buckley's disappearance. Back in Cork, Karen's parents received the devastating news that their daughter was missing. They immediately flew to Glasgow, their hearts filled with dread and desperate hope. They appeared at press conferences, pleading for Karen's safe return, begging anyone with information to come forward. Their anguish was palpable, their faces etched with the terror that only a parent of a missing child can know. The entire community of Cork rallied around them, while in Glasgow, hundreds of volunteers joined search efforts, combing through parks, streets, and any area where Karen might be found. As the investigation intensified, police quickly identified the man in the CCTV footage as Alexander Pacto. They learned that after leaving Kelvin Way, he had driven back to his flat on Dorchester Avenue with Karen's body still in his car. Once inside his apartment, Pacto set about trying to destroy any evidence of what he had done. He purchased cleaning materials and caustic chemicals, gathering supplies that would help him dispose of Karen's remains. With chilling deliberation, he placed her body inside a large barrel and filled it with caustic soda, a corrosive substance designed to dissolve organic matter. He then transported the barrel to High Craigton Farm near Mulgai in East Dunbartonshire, a remote location where he believed it would remain hidden. Meanwhile, detectives were closing in. They brought Pacto in for questioning on April 14th, asking him what he knew about Karen Buckley's disappearance. Pacto claimed that he had met Karen outside the sanctuary and offered her a ride. According to his initial account, they had gone back to his flat, spent some time together, and then Karen had left around 4 in the morning. He presented himself as cooperative, concerned even, just another witness trying to help find the missing woman. The police asked him to return to Helen Street Police Station in Govan the following day to provide a formal witness statement. When Pacto returned on April 15th, his story had changed. Now he claimed that after going back to his apartment, he and Karen had shared drinks and engaged in consensual relations. Then, he said, Karen had accidentally hit her head on the bed frame before leaving at 4 in the morning. The inconsistencies were immediately apparent to the experienced detectives. Pacto's explanations shifted and evolved, each version raising more questions than answers. As he spoke, investigators were gathering physical evidence that would prove far more reliable than his words. That same day, April 15th, the weight of evidence pointing toward Pacto had become overwhelming. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, police officers entered a Starbucks coffee shop in Nelson Mandela Place in Glasgow city centre. Alexander Pacto was sitting inside, perhaps trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy, perhaps waiting to see if his lies would hold. The officers approached him and placed him under arrest on suspicion of murder. As they searched him, they found something telling in his pocket, a handwritten note outlining the statements he had made to police during his earlier interviews. It was essentially a cheat sheet, a reminder of the lies he had told, so he could keep his story straight. The note was damning evidence of consciousness of guilt, proof that Pacto knew he needed to carefully manage his deceptions. With Pacto in custody, police intensified their search efforts. They now had a prime suspect, but still had not found Karen. The investigation team, which had grown to include more than 500 officers, worked tirelessly, following every lead, searching every location connected to Pacto. Their efforts led them to High Craigton Farm. There, hidden away on the property, they found the barrel. Inside, submerged in caustic chemicals, was Karen Buckley's body. For days after she had been reported missing, the agonizing uncertainty came to a terrible end. Karen had been found, but there would be no joyful reunion, no relief. There was only grief, bottomless and consuming. The barrel was transported to Southern General Hospital in Glasgow, where pathologists conducted a post-mortem examination. The findings confirmed the horror of what Karen had endured in her final moments. She had suffered multiple injuries to her neck, evidence of strangulation, and 12 or 13 heavy blows to her head that had fractured her skull and caused fatal bleeding in her brain. Pacto's fingerprints were found inside the barrel, physically linking him to the disposal of her body. The forensic evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. Confronted with this evidence, Pacto changed his story yet again, this time offering a third version of events. He now claimed that during consensual activities, Karen had hit her head, then became angry and slapped him in the face. In retaliation, he said, he struck her repeatedly with the spanner. But investigators and prosecutors did not believe this version any more than they had believed the others. The level of violence, the premeditation evident in having a spanner readily available, the calculated efforts to dispose of her body and destroy evidence, none of it supported the narrative of a spontaneous act born from anger. Detective Superintendent Jim Kerr, who led the investigation, stated publicly that he believed Pacto had a premeditated plan that night to find a victim, any victim. Karen Buckley had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Any woman could have suffered what she did. The attack was, in the words of those who investigated it, unmotivated, senseless, and calculated. In August 2015, Alexander Pacto appeared in the High Court in Glasgow to face murder charges. In a decision that spared Karen's family the additional trauma of a lengthy trial, Pacto pleaded guilty to her murder. On September 7, 2015, he stood before Judge Lady Rita Ray for sentencing. The courtroom was filled with Karen's family, friends, and members of the public who had followed the case with horror and heartbreak. Television cameras were permitted to record the sentencing hearing, a rare occurrence in Scottish courts, reflecting the enormous public interest in the case. Lady Ray delivered her judgment with gravity and obvious emotion. She told Pacto that she found it extremely difficult to find words appropriate to describe the dreadful crime he had committed. Karen Buckley, she said, was a young woman in the prime of her life, much loved and full of potential. For some unknown and inexplicable reason, Pacto had destroyed her life in a matter of minutes. The judge noted that Pacto had concocted multiple stories in an attempt to cover up the murder and had only expressed remorse after pleading guilty. She described his actions as a brutal, senseless, motiveless attack. Lady Ray sentenced Alexander Pacto to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years before he could apply for parole. As she passed sentence, she expressed regret that certain procedural decisions by the prosecution had limited the severity of the punishment she could impose, but she made clear that she could not and would not ignore Pacto's conduct after the killing. Karen Buckley's body was returned to Ireland, to the community and family who had loved her all her life. Her funeral was held in County Cork, and it was an occasion of profound sorrow. Dozens of trainee nurses, each clutching a rose, gathered to pay their respects to a colleague and friend whose life had been stolen from her. The service was filled with tributes celebrating Karen as a woman full of dreams, someone who had brought light and kindness into the world. Her father spoke of the indescribable hurt and pain the family was suffering, of being haunted by thoughts of her murder and her last moments alive. The loss of Karen reverberated through the entire community, touching not only those who knew her personally, but also countless strangers who had followed her story and mourned the waste of such a promising life. In the aftermath of the case, questions lingered that could never be fully answered. Why did Alexander Pacto commit such a horrific act? What drove him to violence that night? Investigators concluded that there was no rational motive, no explanation that would make sense of the senselessness. Pacto and Karen were complete strangers who had never met before that night outside the sanctuary. Their paths crossed by pure chance, a random encounter on a Glasgow street that ended in tragedy. For Karen's family, the randomness of it all made the loss even more unbearable. There was no reason, no logic, nothing that could be pointed to as an explanation. Their daughter, sister, and friend had been murdered simply because she had the misfortune of crossing paths with someone capable of monstrous violence. The case of Karen Buckley became a painful reminder of the vulnerability that exists in everyday life, of the trust that must sometimes be placed in strangers, and of how quickly that trust can be betrayed. It sparked conversations about safety, about the risks young women face, and about the randomness of violence that can shatter lives in moments. For the hundreds of police officers who worked on the investigation, for the prosecutors who brought Pacto to justice, and for the community that rallied to search for Karen, the case left an indelible mark. Today, Alexander Pacto remains in prison, serving his life sentence. Meanwhile, somewhere in County Cork, a family continues to grieve, haunted by the loss of a daughter who should still be with them, building the future she had worked so hard to create. The case is closed, justice has been served in the legal sense, but for those who loved Karen Buckley, the wound will never fully heal. Her memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew her, a reminder of a life filled with promise that ended far too soon, and a stark illustration of how fragile life can be in a world with dark. Story 7. The sun rises hard and fast in the California desert. On March 30th, 1993, it was no different. The light spilled over the jagged peaks of the Coxcomb Mountains, bleaching the sky to a pale, unforgiving blue and washing across the vast, empty expanse of desert center. This is a place of geological time, where the silence is broken only by the whine of wind and the rumble of 18-wheelers barreling down the lonely ribbon of Interstate 10. It's a place of transience, of people going from somewhere to somewhere else, a long, hot corridor between the promise of California and the dusty plains of Arizona. On that Tuesday morning, a maintenance worker was making a routine check of the eastbound Hayfield Road on-ramp, a desolate curve of asphalt that served as a brief punctuation mark in the endless sentence of the highway. The landscape was a palette of browns and grays, dotted with the stubborn green of creosote bushes. But against this muted backdrop, something was jarringly out of place. A splash of color, a shape that didn't belong. As the worker drew closer, the shape resolved into a human form. It was the body of a woman, partially clothed and discarded like a piece of roadside refuse. She lay in the scrub and gravel just off the pavement, a silent testament to a final, brutal act of violence. The desert had already begun its work, the harsh sun and dry air conspiring to erase the final moments of her life. But they could not erase the truth of what had happened to her. She had been murdered. Her name, investigators would soon learn, was Sherry Herrera. She was 30 years old, a mother of 4 children who were waiting for her to come home in Tulare, a small city hundreds of miles away in California's Central Valley. The discovery of Sherry's body on that lonely on-ramp was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a question that would echo through the halls of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department for nearly 3 decades. Who had left her there, and why? The answer would remain buried, a secret kept by the vast, anonymous network of American highways and the man who used them as his hunting ground. The long, cold winter of the investigation had just begun. When the call came in, it was just another day for the detectives of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Homicide in the desert was not uncommon, a grim feature of a landscape that offered both solitude and secrecy. But the scene at the Hayfield Road on-ramp was particularly bleak. There was a profound sense of abandonment about it, the feeling that Sherry Herrera had been erased not just from life, but from the world itself. The initial investigation was a race against the elements and the relentless passage of time. The crime scene was a canvas of dust and gravel, fragile and easily disturbed. Detectives walked the area in a grid, their eyes scanning for anything that might tell them who Sherry was and what had happened to her. They found little. There was no purse, no identification, no personal belongings that might offer a clue. The killer had been careful, stripping her of her identity before leaving her in this desolate place. The coroner's preliminary examination at the scene revealed the violence of her last moments. The official report would later confirm the grim details. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with a belt. The evidence collected from her body was meticulously preserved. Scraps of biological material that, in 1993, held only a faint promise of future justice. DNA technology was still in its relative infancy, a tool that was more aspirational than practical for many underfunded departments. Still, the swabs were taken, the samples cataloged and stored away in a freezer, a silent, frozen prayer for a scientific breakthrough that was still years away. The first task was to put a name to the victim. Without an identity, she was just another Jane Doe, another statistic in a binder full of unsolved cases. A broadcast was sent out to law enforcement agencies across the state with a description of the woman. It didn't take long to get a match. The description fit that of Sherry Herrera, a 30-year-old woman who had been reported missing from Tulare County just days earlier. With her name came the first, fragmented pieces of her story. She was a mother of 4 young children. Her life was complicated, a tapestry of struggle and survival. Court records would later describe her as a known prostitute and drug abuser who worked the highway rest area, a stark and clinical summary of a life lived on the margins. Detectives learned she was last seen alive being dropped off at a rest stop between Tulare and Pixley. She had told the person who dropped her off that she had made arrangements to be picked up just 10 minutes later. She was never seen alive again. How had she traveled the 250 miles from a Central Valley rest stop to a desolate on-ramp in the Mojave Desert? The answer seemed obvious: a truck. The highways are the arteries of the nation. and the truckers who pilot their massive rigs are the lifeblood of its commerce. They are a nomadic tribe, a constant river of humanity flowing from coast to coast. For a woman working the rest stops, a long-haul trucker was a likely client, a potential ride, and as it turned out, a potential predator. The theory was simple and chilling. Sherry had gotten into a truck with the wrong man. Somewhere along the dark miles of Interstate 10, the transaction had turned violent. He had assaulted her, killed her, and then, with the cold pragmatism of someone cleaning up a mess, had pulled over at the first convenient spot and left her body in the desert before merging back into the anonymous flow of traffic, a ghost disappearing into the night. Investigators worked the case hard. They interviewed other women who worked the rest stops, hoping someone had seen Sherry get into a specific truck. They canvassed truck stops, showing her photo, asking if anyone recognized her. But the world of the long-haul trucker is transient by nature. Faces blur, and memories fade with the miles. No one remembered anything. The leads dried up as quickly as a desert rain. The case, which had begun with a jolt of brutal urgency, slowly bled out, losing momentum with each passing week, and then month, and then year. For Sherry Herrera's family, the silence was its own form of torture. Her 4 children were left with a void, a gaping hole where their mother used to be. Her son, Adrian Herrera, was just 6 years old. The memory of the day he learned of his mother's death was seared into his mind, a trauma that would never fully heal. I remember coming home from school, and my stepmom told us the news what had happened. He would recall decades later. Me and my sister were there. Obviously, we started bawling our eyes out. For 30 years, that grief was all they had. The case file for Sherry Herrera's murder was placed in a box and put on a shelf in the cold case unit. It joined hundreds of other files, each one a story of a life cut short, a family left to wonder, and a killer who had gotten away with it. The desert kept its secrets, and the wheels of justice ground to a halt. For nearly 3 decades, the ghost of Sherry Herrera haunted the highways of California. Her file gathered dust, a relic of a time before the digital age, before the forensic revolution that would change police work forever. But while the case lay dormant, the science did not. The fragile biological samples collected from her body in 1993, once a long shot, were now a treasure trove of information waiting to be unlocked. In the early 2000s, the FBI launched the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, a national database that allowed law enforcement agencies to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes with those of convicted offenders and arrestees across the country. Suddenly, a cold case in California could be solved by an arrest in Florida. The invisible threads connecting violent crimes across jurisdictions became visible for the first time. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department, like countless other agencies, began systematically submitting DNA from their cold cases to CODIS, hoping for a match. The evidence from Sherry Herrera's case was sent in, a digital ghost in the machine, waiting for its echo. For years, there was nothing. The echo finally came, not from California, but from Texas. In April 1992, a year before Sherry Herrera was killed, the body of another woman, Shinda Denise Hayes, had been found in rural Titus County, Texas. Like Sherry, she had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The case had also gone cold, another file in another cabinet 1,000 miles away. But the Texas Rangers, like their counterparts in Riverside County, were persistent. They too had preserved DNA evidence, and with advancements in forensic genealogy, they were able to build a family tree from the killer's DNA, a revolutionary technique that had cracked some of the nation's most notorious cold cases. The genealogical trail led them to one man, Douglas Thomas, a recently retired cross-country truck driver living in Waco, Texas. In May 2022, the Texas Rangers arrested the 67-year-old Thomas on suspicion of the murder of Shinda Hayes. As part of his arrest, a DNA sample was taken and entered into CODIS. And then it happened. A computer in a lab flagged a match. The DNA profile from the 1992 Texas murder scene was a perfect match to the DNA profile from the 1993 murder scene of Sherry Herrera in California. After 29 years, the ghost on the highway finally had a face. The news hit the Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team like a lightning strike. The team, a dedicated unit of investigators from the DA's office, the Sheriff's Department, the FBI, and the Riverside Police Department, pulled Sherry Herrera's file from the archives. The faded photographs, the brittle reports, the story of a mother of four left on a desert on-ramp. It all came rushing back into focus. The profile of Douglas Thomas fit their initial theory perfectly. He had been a long-haul trucker for over 40 years, traveling extensively across the United States. He was a man who lived his life on the road, a shadow moving through the background of American life. The highways were his workplace, his home, and his hunting ground. He was exactly the kind of predator they had suspected from the beginning. Investigators from the Riverside Cold Case team traveled to Texas to interview Thomas in the jail where he was being held. They sat across from a man who was now in his late 60s, no longer the powerful figure who had once commanded an 80,000-pound rig. He was just an old man in a prison jumpsuit. But as they questioned him about the murder of Sherry Herrera, they saw the shadow of the man he once was. The details of that interview remain sealed, but what followed spoke volumes. Shortly after the Riverside detectives returned to California, the district attorney's office formally charged Douglas Thomas with the 1993 murder of Sherry Herrera. Along with the murder charge, they filed a special circumstance allegation, murder in the commission of a rape. The news of the arrest was a shockwave for Sherry's family. After 3 decades of silence, of believing this day would never come, the call from the DA's office felt surreal. "I don't know if I really believed it, because it's like, man, this has been so long," Adrian Herrera said. The 6-year-old boy who had cried in his stepmother's arms was now a grown man, and the justice he had long given up on was suddenly within reach. The legal path to bringing Thomas to California was complex. He first had to face justice in Texas for the murder of Shinda Hayes. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge in that case, and was sentenced to 40 years to life in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. But the Riverside County DA's office was determined that he would also answer for Sherry's murder. They initiated the Interstate Agreement on Detainers, a legal process that allows a state to take temporary custody of a prisoner from another state to face trial. In August 2025, Douglas Thomas was extradited to California and booked into the Robert Presley Detention Center in Riverside. On September 10, 2025, he appeared in a Riverside County courtroom. Now 71 years old, he stood before the judge and, in a clear voice, pleaded not guilty to the murder of Sherry Herrera. The trial is pending. A felony settlement conference is scheduled for December 2025. For the family of Sherry Herrera, it is the beginning of the final chapter in a story that has defined their lives for 3 decades. The wheels of justice, which had been frozen for so long, are finally turning. The case against Douglas Thomas, built on a foundation of scientific innovation and dogged police work, is a testament to the idea that no case is ever truly cold, and no victim is ever truly forgotten. The man who once haunted the highways as a nameless predator is now just an old man in a jail cell, his freedom gone, his anonymity shattered. He is no longer a ghost. He is a defendant. And for the first time in 30 years, the story is no longer about the mystery of Sherry Herrera's death, but about the certainty of her killer's reckoning. The desert may hold its secrets, but in the end, the truth, like the harsh desert sun, always finds a way to break through.